The weight of unspoken words pressed down, a familiar ache in the chest. How does one quantify the slow erosion of the spirit? The subtle slights, the doors deliberately left ajar, only to slam shut at the last moment? It wasn't the grand betrayals that crippled, but the constant, dripping faucet of unfairness, the cold indifference of those who held power. Every morning felt like strapping on armor just to walk through the day, hoping it wouldn't buckle under the pressure of judgment and bias, simply because of the color of her skin and the curve of her voice. This story is about that pressure, the moments it felt unbearable, and the unexpected strength found in the crucible of injustice. It's about the quiet fight against overwhelming odds, the struggle for dignity in a world that seemed determined to deny it. If you've ever felt overlooked, pushed aside, or judged unfairly, you know the sting. Join us as we unravel this journey of resilience. Please show your support for stories that champion justice by hitting that like button and subscribing to uncover more narratives that illuminate the path from despair to triumph. The morning dew clung to the grass blades bordering Elm Street, each tiny droplet catching the nascent light like scattered diamonds. Maria walked her usual route, the rhythm of her worn sneakers on the pavement, a comforting, predictable beat. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from old Mrs. Gable's garden. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way that mattered externally. The sky overhead was a pale, unblemished blue, promising a day of gentle warmth. She passed Mr. Henderson setting out his newspaper, waved at the poodle pulling Mrs. Rodriguez down the sidewalk, each small interaction a thread in the familiar tapestry of her life. Her small, rented house, the quiet street, the worn but reliable car parked in the driveway. It was a life built brick by painstaking brick, stable and unassuming. Yet beneath the surface of this ordinary morning, a subtle current stirred. It wasn't a conscious fear, more a lingering residue of past experiences, a low hum of awareness that the peace could be fragile. She remembered the dismissive glances in the grocery store, the assumption by strangers that she couldn't possibly afford the better cut of meat, the way voices sometimes changed pitch when addressing her on the phone. These were small things, like pebbles tossed into a still pond, causing ripples that spread unseen beneath the calm surface. Her destination was the corporate office downtown, a place of glass and steel that felt a world away from the quiet charm of Elm Street. It was where she spent her days, navigating spreadsheets and project timelines, and increasingly, the more complex, unspoken currents of office dynamics. There was a tension in the air there lately, a shift she couldn't quite place, a feeling that the ground was subtly shifting beneath her feet. But as she walked, breathing in the clean morning air, the bulk of her thoughts were mundane. The grocery list for the evening, the report due by Friday, the slight ache in her left knee. The day stretched ahead, seemingly like any other, cloaked in the comforting predictability of routine, utterly unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The familiar path lay ahead, clear and well-trodden, offering no hint of the sharp turn it was about to take. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. As she walked, her worn bag clutched tight against her side. It started subtly, a prickle on the back of her neck, the kind that signals unseen eyes. Then, the glances. Not casual passing ones, but lingering, pointed stares that seemed to dissect her from head to toe. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the rhythm of her own footsteps, but the weight of their gaze grew heavier with every block. A group loitering near a boarded-up storefront fell silent as she approached. Their laughter evaporated, replaced by a palpable stillness, broken only by the distant drone of traffic. Their eyes tracked her, cold and assessing. One woman, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, didn't just look, she scanned her. A slow, deliberate sweep that felt like a physical invasion. Her lips curled slightly, a silent, dismissive expression that needed no words to convey contempt. Another man beside her shifted his weight, turning his back slightly, a clear signal of disinterest, of deeming her unworthy of even a moment's acknowledgement beyond that initial, chilling scrutiny. The air around her seemed to grow thin, suffocating. It wasn't just the looks, it was the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden hostility that had bloomed from nothing. She could almost taste the disapproval, bitter and sharp on her tongue. The easy flow of pedestrian traffic seemed to part around her, as if she carried an invisible aura of undesirability. People on the opposite side of the street averted their gazes quickly if she happened to catch their eye, eager not to be associated, not to draw the same unwanted attention to themselves. The feeling of being utterly alone, exposed, and judged intensified with every passing moment. This wasn't just walking down the street. It was traversing a gauntlet of silent condemnation, an unsettling feeling solidifying into a heavy, undeniable truth. She was unwanted here. The easy comfort of anonymity had vanished, replaced by the raw, vulnerable exposure of being seen, observed, and found lacking in their eyes. The world had suddenly narrowed, focusing solely on her and their collective quiet disdain. It felt like the beginning of something deeply unpleasant, a storm gathering on a clear day. The air in the break room, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and microwave leftovers, suddenly turned frigid. For weeks, the dismissive glances and hushed, cutting remarks had buzzed around her like persistent flies, easy enough to swat away or pretend weren't there. They were the dull throb of a headache, a low-grade discomfort she'd learned to endure. But this time, the low throb erupted into a searing, blinding pain. She stood by the counter, a simple task in her hands, fetching a glass of water, when his voice, laced with an almost bored disdain, sliced through the mundane quiet. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of generations of prejudice, an insidious poison delivered with a casual flick of the tongue. He didn't even look at her as he spoke to a colleague across the room, but the words were meant for her ears, a deliberate, public humiliation disguised as an offhand comment.
Honestly, hiring folks like her, it's just asking for trouble. You can't expect them to understand how things work around here. It's not in their nature.
Them. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud, heavy and suffocating. Not people, not employees, but them. And their nature. Her stomach plummeted, a cold, hard knot forming instantly. Her fingers, moments before reaching for the water jug, froze, mid-air, trembling slightly. The casual indifference in his tone was perhaps the most shocking part, as if stating that her very being, tied directly to the color of her skin, disqualified her from competence, was simply a fact of life, like the weather. She felt the blood drain from her face, replaced by a hot, prickling shame that had no logical place, yet settled deep within her bones. Her ears roared, muffling the sounds of the office around her. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker, casting the room in a nauseating strobe. Disbelief warred with a dawning, awful certainty. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or an awkward moment. This was the line being crossed, explicitly and publicly. The subtle jabs, the veiled criticisms, the patronizing smiles, they had all been leading to this. It was overt, ugly, and undeniable racism, delivered with a sickening lack of remorse. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. It wasn't just the words. It was the implication, the dismissal of her worth, her capabilities, her very humanity, all based on a grotesque, archaic stereotype. The break room suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. She was trapped, exposed, wounded by a verbal assault that cut far deeper than any physical blow. The shock was a physical entity, vibrating through her body, leaving her momentarily breathless and utterly stunned. The conflict had not just begun. It had erupted with a devastating force, leaving her reeling in its wake. A sudden, sharp sound, not necessarily loud, but piercingly unexpected, seemed to pop the bubble of normalcy that had surrounded her just moments before. The words, laced with venom and prejudice, struck like physical blows, leaving her breathless. Time seemed to distort, stretching into an agonizing eternity, while simultaneously snapping shut, trapping her in the exact instant the aggression landed. She felt an immediate, visceral recoil, as though a cold hand had clamped around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her breath hitched, a ragged, silent gasp caught somewhere between her throat and her heart. Around her, the mundane sounds of the public space, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of conversations, the clatter of something dropped, seemed to fade into a dull roar. Or perhaps they simply vanished from her awareness entirely. All she could focus on was the lingering echo of the hateful words and the faces of those who had uttered them, now fixed upon her with a look that combined cruel anticipation and utter indifference. Her body felt heavy, rooted to the spot, yet simultaneously light and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Her hands, which had been loosely holding her bag strap, began to tremble uncontrollably. A fine tremor that started in her fingertips and vibrated up her arms. A hot flush spread across her face, followed swiftly by a chilling wave of cold that seemed to settle deep within her bones. She felt exposed, utterly vulnerable under their gaze and the potential gaze of unseen bystanders. The simple act of existing in this public square had become a terrifying performance she hadn't auditioned for, forced onto a stage under the harsh glare of prejudice. Processing was impossible. Her mind, usually quick and sharp, felt sluggish and thick, like wading through deep mud. Did they really just say that? To me? Here? The questions tumbled silently, unanswered, stuck behind a wall of shock. Reaction, too, felt like a foreign concept. Her limbs refused to cooperate, frozen by the sheer audacity and cruelty of the attack. Every instinct screamed to run, to lash out, to defend herself, but her body remained locked in place, a statue carved from fear and disbelief. In that moment, surrounded by people who either participated in her humiliation or stood by in silence, she felt profoundly alone. She was the underdog, singled out, cornered in a public space that offered no sanctuary, no immediate ally. The open air felt suffocating, the surrounding structures looming, witnesses to her sudden unwanted diminishment. The weight of their aggression, coupled with the terrifying feeling of being paralyzed and exposed, pressed down on her, making it difficult just to stand upright. She was caught, helpless, suspended in the brutal reality of the moment, unsure if she could even remember how to breathe properly. The biting words hung in the air, heavy and putrid, a stench no one else seemed to notice. She stood exposed, feeling the harsh glare of judgment not just from the aggressor, but from the silent witnesses surrounding them. It was in the subtle shifts of weight, the quick glances away, the way hands suddenly became intensely interested in adjusting collars or checking phones. A knot of cold dread tightened in her stomach. The world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Yet everyone else remained perfectly still, rooted in their comfortable indifference. She saw the woman with the bright red scarf clutch her bag tighter, eyes fixed resolutely on the display window. The man in the sharp suit adjusted his tie, his face a mask of studied detachment. A group of teenagers nearby, who had been laughing loudly moments before, suddenly fell silent, their eyes darting towards the scene, then quickly averting, giggling nervously as they nudged each other. It wasn't outright hostility she saw in most faces, but something far more chilling. Blank non-recognition. It was as if she had become invisible, or worse, someone whose struggle was simply not worth acknowledging. The aggressor's voice, sharp and cutting, seemed to amplify in the sudden, thick silence of the onlookers. They were making a spectacle of her vulnerability, and the audience was passively enabling it. The lack of intervention wasn't just inaction. It felt like a tacit agreement, a silent vote cast against her. Yes, continue. This is not our problem. The air tasted of metallic shame and the bitter dust of isolation. Each averted gaze was a brick added to the wall building around her, sealing her off in a lonely struggle. She could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the deafening quiet of public apathy. The warmth of the afternoon sun felt suddenly cold on her skin, a stark contrast to the heat rising in her cheeks, a flush born of humiliation and simmering, impotent rage. This wasn't just battling one person. It felt like battling the crushing weight of an entire world looking the other way. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, an underdog cornered with no cheering section, no helping hand, only the cold, hard reality of indifference. Her legs felt heavy, like lead weights dragging through thick mud. Every step away from the scene of the conflict was a struggle, not just against the sudden weakness in her limbs, but against an invisible force pulling her back into the swirling vortex of anger and humiliation she was desperate to escape. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on the doorframe as she pushed through the exit. The cold air outside hit her face like a shock, a sharp contrast to the stifling, overheated room she had just fled. The sounds of the office faded behind her. The murmurs, the faint echo of cruel laughter, the sharp click of a closing door. They were like physical blows, even in their retreat. Her own breathing was ragged, shallow gasps that did little to fill the sudden emptiness in her chest. It ached, a dull, persistent throb that mirrored the knot tightening in her stomach. A bitter taste coated her tongue, the lingering metallic tang of unshed tears mingling with the acrid flavor of injustice. She hugged her arms around herself, not against the external chill, but against the bone-deep coldness that had settled inside her soul. Hurt was a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders, its fabric rough and unforgiving. It pressed down, making her feel small and insignificant, whispering insidious doubts into her ear about her worth, her strength. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, a volatile energy that made her hands tremble and her jaw clench. She wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness, but the energy was trapped, suffocating her from within. Shame was perhaps the heaviest weight of all, a burning blush that she could still feel creeping up her neck. Shame at being targeted, shame at being vulnerable, shame at feeling so utterly exposed and defeated. It clung to her like a second skin, hot and prickly, making her want to disappear, to vanish from the face of the earth. Confusion swirled around the edges of these raw emotions. Why? The question echoed in her mind, a relentless hammer blow against her skull. Why did this happen? Why me? What did I do to deserve this? There were no answers, only a swirling void of uncertainty that added another layer to the crushing burden she carried. Each step on the pavement was a conscious effort, her feet hitting the ground with a jarring finality. The world outside seemed muted, colors duller, sounds distant. Her focus was entirely internal, on the chaotic storm raging within her. The need to escape was primal, a frantic urge to put distance between herself and the source of her pain, to find a space where she could breathe, where the weight might not feel so crushing. She walked blindly, driven by nothing more than the desperate instinct for survival, carrying the invisible, agonizing baggage of the conflict away with her, one trembling step at a time. The world outside blurred as the bus pulled away, leaving the scene of the attack behind. Aisha slumped in her seat, her hands still trembling slightly, though the physical distance grew with every passing block. Inside, however, the encounter wasn't over. It was just beginning its relentless replay. Her mind, a cruel theater, projected the moments onto the backs of her eyelids, the smirk on his face, the cutting words, the cold indifference in her eyes. It all cycled through, a broken reel stuck on repeat. She could hear their voices as clearly as if they were still standing over her.
Look at this one. Thinks she belongs here.
The sound was a physical blow, landing squarely in her gut, stealing the air from her lungs all over again. Then the female voice, like ice shards.
Yeah, maybe go back where you came from. You're not welcome.
The words, delivered with such casual cruelty, felt like a brand pressed against her skin, burning long after they were uttered. A bitter taste filled her mouth, the lingering metallic tang of fear and adrenaline. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, a small, private pain to anchor her against the swirling storm inside. Every muscle in her body ached with the tension she hadn't released, couldn't release, not even now. The sting of the injustice was a raw, throbbing wound, one that the simple act of leaving couldn't heal. But what gnawed at her most was the silence she had offered in return. Not true silence, perhaps a choked gasp or a whispered plea, but certainly not the defiant, articulate response she now crafted in the quiet solitude of her mind. Why hadn't she said? Why hadn't she pointed out? The possibilities cascaded, sharp retorts, calm, reasoned arguments, fierce demands for respect. Each imagined word felt powerful, a satisfying counterblow that had been tragically absent in the moment it was needed. The inability to deliver that satisfying response fueled a deep internal conflict. She felt weak, defeated not just by their words, but by her own perceived failure to stand firm, to rise above the shock and find her voice. The emotional trauma wasn't just the attack itself, but the agonizing post-mortem, the relentless questioning of her own actions, or lack thereof. She relived the helplessness, the sudden, paralyzing vulnerability that had stolen her words, her breath, her ability to fight back in the way her heart now screamed she should have. It was a heavy weight to carry, the burden of injustice compounded by the sting of silence. The chill in the air felt different now. It didn't just bite, it felt sharp, hostile, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at exposed skin. The familiar streets she had walked 1,000 times seemed to rearrange themselves into unfamiliar, slightly menacing angles. Each brick building, once a comforting presence, now loomed, casting long, suspicious shadows. She found herself scanning faces, not with casual curiosity, but with a sudden, sharp apprehension. Were they looking at her? Did they know? Did they agree with them? Every casual glance from a passerby felt like a potential judgment, a silent accusation waiting to burst forth. A group, laughing on a corner, sent a jolt of fear through her. The sound, once just background noise, now seemed laced with potential mockery. She clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather, a useless shield against the invisible threat that now seemed to permeate the very air she breathed. The ground beneath her feet, usually solid and dependable, felt subtly unsteady, as if the world itself had tilted on its axis. A profound, lingering unease settled deep in her gut, a cold, heavy stone that wouldn't budge. It wasn't just the memory of the words spoken, the venom in their eyes. It was the chilling realization that her sense of safety had been a fragile illusion, shattered in an instant. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare in a way she had never experienced before. The world, moments ago, a place she navigated with quiet confidence, had transformed into a landscape dotted with potential hazards, invisible tripwires of prejudice and hate. Suspicion became her unwanted companion. The friendly nod from a neighbor felt less genuine. The polite smile from the shopkeeper seemed thin, hiding something beneath the surface. Could anyone be trusted? Was everyone a potential enemy, simply waiting for the right moment? She felt a growing sense of isolation, even amidst the bustling crowds. The shared human space felt poisoned, and she was suddenly acutely aware of being an outsider, marked and vulnerable. This new reality was exhausting, demanding a constant vigilance she hadn't known she possessed or needed. She was no longer just walking through her day. She was navigating a minefield, every step cautious, every interaction fraught with unspoken tension. The easy rhythm of her life was broken, replaced by a jerky, uncertain gait, a constant low-grade fear humming just beneath her skin. She was the underdog now, acutely aware of the arbitrary forces that could strike again, leaving her powerless against the negativity that felt like it was now lurking around every corner. She sought refuge in the familiar rhythm of the city park, the place where sunbeams often played across worn paths and the distant murmur of traffic usually faded into the rustling of leaves. A warm breeze, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, brushed against her skin, a touch meant to soothe. She sat on a bench carved with forgotten initials, the wood smooth and aged beneath her hands, and watched a squirrel dart frantically up the rough bark of an oak tree. She tried to focus on the simple, everyday beauty, to anchor herself in the present, away from the echoing nightmare that had consumed her days. But the tranquility was a fragile illusion. The scent of the flowers seemed to twist, momentarily carrying the acrid tang she remembered from that horrifying space. The squirrel's sudden movement triggered a jolt of adrenaline, the kind that had flooded her veins when fear had been her only companion. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the images away, the harsh glare, the cold glint in their eyes. A shiver, not from the breeze, traced a path down her spine. She opened her eyes and stared at the path, seeing not the cracked asphalt and scattered leaves, but the floor of that place, the one she desperately wanted to forget. The murmur of distant voices coalesced into the sharp, cutting words that had been flung at her, words designed to diminish and hurt. She could almost hear the laughter, cold and devoid of mercy, that had followed her retreat. The simple bench no longer felt like a haven. It felt exposed, vulnerable. Everywhere she looked, the world seemed subtly altered, tinged with the memory of what had happened. The vibrant green of the grass seemed less hopeful, the bright blue sky less vast and protective. Even the comfortable weight of her own coat felt wrong, reminding her of the clothes she'd worn that day, the way they had felt against her skin, heavy with dread. She stood up, the need to escape this unsettling feeling overpowering her desire for peace. She walked, but the familiar path felt strange underfoot, as if the ground itself held the tremor of her fear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety, a stark contrast to the calm she craved. She yearned for normalcy, for the ability to simply be in a place without the shadow of that incident falling over it. But the trauma clung to her, a persistent, unwelcome companion, whispering doubts and fears, making every step feel less secure, reminding her that safety wasn't just a physical state, but a feeling that had been brutally stolen from her. The park, the familiar scents and sounds, were supposed to be a balm, but they only highlighted how deeply wounded her spirit was, how the fight to feel normal was a battle in itself. The city pulsed with its familiar, indifferent rhythm, a beat she usually matched with practiced ease. But today, the weight of recent events, the stinging echoes of cruel words and unjust treatment, pressed down on her like a physical force. Her usual route home felt suffocatingly predictable, each corner a reminder of her daily struggle. The paved street ahead, lined with the usual shops and hurried faces, seemed to stretch into an endless, gray monotony. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, a deep weariness that went beyond the physical. Her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly under the invisible burden she carried. As she approached the turn she took every evening, a flicker of something else caught her attention. Not a grand spectacle, but a small, almost hidden doorway tucked between a noisy cafe and a dry cleaner. It belonged to a place she'd passed countless times without a second glance, a dusty, unassuming used bookstore. She'd always dismissed it as just another faded storefront, lost in the city's blur. But today, it felt different. A soft, warm light spilled from the windows, casting a gentle glow onto the grimy sidewalk. There was no logical reason, no pressing need for a book, yet her feet seemed to slow of their own accord. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an undeniable pull, a subtle but insistent whisper of intuition urging her to deviate, to step off the well-worn path. The stale air of the street suddenly felt too tight, and the thought of entering that quiet space offered a strange, sudden solace. Without fully understanding why, she veered sharply, her worn shoes scraping softly on the pavement, as she turned towards the small, inviting rectangle of light. The bell above the door tinkled softly as she pushed it open, a sound that seemed to shiver in the sudden quiet. The air inside was thick with the comforting, slightly sweet smell of aged paper and ink, mingled with a faint hint of something else. Perhaps tea brewing in a hidden corner, or the scent of old, polished wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering from the street lamps outside and the single bare bulb overhead. Towering bookshelves crammed haphazardly with volumes of all sizes, created narrow, winding aisles that felt like secret passages. It was a labyrinth of stories, a sanctuary built from forgotten words. The city's roar faded to a distant hum outside these thick walls of literature. Her hand brushed against the spine of a leather-bound book as she stepped further inside, the cool, dry touch grounding her. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a fragile calm in the heart of the storm that had been her day. This unexpected detour, this step into the quiet, dusty embrace of the bookstore, felt like more than just a change of scenery. It felt like fate itself had gently nudged her towards an unknown, pivotal moment. The chill of the evening air offered little comfort against the raw ache in her chest. She sat on the worn park bench, the city's distant hum a mournful backdrop to the quiet storm inside her. Each passing face seemed to hold the potential for another jab, another dismissive glance, another painful reminder of her place in the world they had constructed for her. Her hands clenched, knuckles white against the rough wood. She closed her eyes, inhaling the damp scent of fallen leaves, trying to root herself in the simple reality of the park, away from the suffocating weight of her circumstances. When she opened them, a man was sitting at the other end of the bench. He hadn't been there moments before. He wasn't like the others she usually encountered, loud, imposing, their faces etched with judgment or contempt. This man was quiet, his posture relaxed yet alert. He seemed older, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with a kind face framed by silvering hair. His eyes, the color of warm mahogany, held a depth that felt unsettlingly calm. Her immediate instinct was a familiar jolt of anxiety. Here it comes, she thought, the predictable shift in the atmosphere, the thinly veiled hostility. She braced herself, shoulders tensing, ready to become small, invisible, anything to deflect the anticipated negativity. She waited for the sidelong glance, the scoff, the muttered word, the subtle shift away, as if her mere presence was contamination. But it didn't come. He simply sat there, gaze fixed on the rustling trees, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. There was no malice in his expression, no flicker of recognition that she was that person, the one they talked about, the one they dismissed. He smelled faintly of old books and something earthy, like rain on dry soil. It was a smell that spoke of quiet places and forgotten stories. After a few moments, his gaze drifted towards her, not with a challenging stare, but with a gentle, acknowledging look. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, like smooth riverstones.
Beautiful evening, isn't it? The way the light catches the leaves.
It was such a simple observation, yet it struck her with the force of a physical blow. No accusation, no judgment, just a shared appreciation for the quiet beauty of the moment. Her breath hitched. She hadn't realized how tight her chest had been until it suddenly eased a fraction. Could it be possible? Could this interaction be different? The thought was terrifying in its novelty. For so long, every encounter had been tainted, leaving her feeling smaller, more alone. Was this a trick? A prelude to cruelty delivered with false kindness? Or was it, finally, a crack in the wall of relentless negativity that had surrounded her? A fragile tendril of hope, hesitant and vulnerable, began to unfurl in the barren landscape of her heart. The cruel laughter of the bullies echoed, sharp and unforgiving, in the sterile hall. Eleanor felt the weight of their words pressing down on her, heavy as stones. Her throat was tight, her eyes stinging, and the familiar knot of despair twisted in her gut. This was it, she thought. The final degradation, witnessed by indifferent eyes. The male bully leaned closer, his voice dripping with false sympathy.
You really thought you could get away with it, didn't you? So pathetic!
Beside him, the female bully smirked, a cold, calculating glint in her eye.
Some people just don't know their place. Maybe this'll teach you.
Eleanor shrank back, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. The air felt thick and suffocating, smelling faintly of dust and defeat. Then a subtle movement at the edge of her vision. The stranger, the one who had been standing quietly by the potted palm tree, took a single deliberate step forward. He wasn't rushing, wasn't shouting a warning, nothing dramatic in the usual sense. Instead, he simply raised his hand. In his palm lay a small, dark object, a plain, black USB drive. He didn't speak. His eyes, calm and steady, met Eleanor's for a fleeting second before sweeping over the faces of the bullies and the onlookers. Slowly, with a precision that felt unnervingly significant, he extended his arm towards a small, unoccupied side table near where the confrontation was happening. He didn't throw it, didn't drop it with a flourish. He simply placed the USB drive gently on the polished wood surface. A collective hush fell over the small crowd. The bullies' voices trailed off, their expressions freezing mid-smirk. All eyes were drawn to the tiny black object resting innocuously on the table. It seemed utterly out of place, mundane yet pregnant with unspoken meaning. What was this? Why was he doing this? The questions hung unspoken in the sudden silence, thick with burgeoning curiosity and a strange, unsettling tension. It wasn't a threat, not an obvious intervention, but this quiet, peculiar action had instantly hijacked the narrative, diverting the stream of malice towards itself. A flicker of confusion crossed the male bully's face, quickly replaced by suspicion. The female bully narrowed her eyes, her smile gone. Eleanor, too, stared at the USB drive, her mind racing, her fear momentarily overridden by sheer bewilderment. The stranger remained silent, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, letting the simple act of placing the small object on the table speak volumes, hinting at a gift, a secret, or a consequence that was just beginning to unfold. The air in the opulent boardroom had been thick with unspoken threats and stifled desperation. Maria sat small and quiet, the weight of the assembled hostility pressing down on her, while the polished faces across the table wore cruel, expectant smiles. They had cornered her, it seemed, ready to deliver the final blow. The stranger, the quiet figure who had observed silently from the corner, now stood, his movements slow and deliberate, drawing every eye. He carried a slim, dark leather briefcase. He walked towards the large, gleaming mahogany table, the soft click of his expensive shoes the only sound breaking the tense silence. He didn't look at the smug faces of the executives. His gaze was fixed solely on Maria. Reaching the table's edge near her, he placed the briefcase down with a soft thud that echoed loudly in the sudden quiet. A faint scent of old paper and expensive leather emanated from it. He flipped open the latches, their metallic snap sharp and final. Inside, nestled on crimson velvet lining, lay a single folded document and a heavy, ornate seal. The stranger gently lifted the document, holding it out not to the company lawyers or the sneering bullies, but directly to Maria. His hand was steady, his expression unreadable, yet there was a quiet strength in his bearing. The document felt crisp and significant in her trembling fingers. She folded it slowly, her eyes wide with apprehension, expecting perhaps a final dismissal, a legal technicality she couldn't fight. but the words she saw blurred at first, then swam into horrifying, breathtaking clarity. The color drained from the faces across the table. Gasps, sharp and ragged, pierced the silence. One of the female executives, the one whose disdainful laughter had often cut deepest, looked as if she might faint, her perfectly made-up face now a mask of shock and fear. The lead bully, his face usually a picture of arrogant confidence, stammered, his voice cracking.
What is that? What have you given her?
The stranger's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, deep, and resonated with an undeniable authority that instantly silenced the room. It was the voice of someone accustomed to holding power, a voice that brokered no argument.
It is a gift, madam, a transfer of ownership.
He paused, letting the implications hang heavy in the air. Maria's eyes scanned the document again, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The words, they couldn't be right. It stated, in stark legal terms, that she, Maria, was now the majority shareholder, that she owned this company. The document felt impossibly real in her hands, the paper cool against her clammy skin. The sheer, unexpected magnitude of it stole her breath. This wasn't just help. This was a complete, irreversible reversal of fortune. The twist had arrived, shattering the oppressive atmosphere like glass, flooding the room with an entirely new, terrifying, and utterly unexpected reality. A tidal wave of sensation crashed over her the moment the package was placed in her trembling hands. It wasn't heavy, yet it felt weighted with an impossible significance. Her breath hitched, catching somewhere deep in her chest, and the bustling world around her seemed to blur and recede, leaving only her and this unexpected object. Shock, sharp and disorienting, seized her first. Her eyes, still swollen from the tears shed in isolation just hours before, widened in sheer disbelief. A low, confused murmur escaped her lips, barely audible even to herself. What was this? Why? Confusion warred with a fragile sense of hope she hadn't dared to entertain. She traced the simple wrapping paper, the ribbon tied with careful hands. It was utterly unlike anything she had ever received, especially after the relentless, crushing weight of the past few weeks. The cruelty, the dismissiveness, the feeling of being utterly alone and abandoned. It had settled upon her spirit like a shroud of lead. Every smile had felt forced, every step heavy, every breath a conscious effort against the suffocating despair. She had carried the bitter taste of betrayal and injustice in her mouth, the sting of public humiliation etched into her very soul. But this was different. The smooth paper felt cool under her fingertips, a simple, tangible reality in a world that had felt so brutally unreal. She didn't need to open it yet. The fact of it was enough to shatter the carefully constructed numbness she had built around herself. Disbelief flickered in her gaze. It felt like a trick, a mirage in the desert of her pain. Who would do this? After everything, after being made to feel so utterly worthless, so disposable, the kindness felt alien, almost frightening in its intensity. Then the tears came. Not the hot, angry tears of frustration, or the silent, desolate tears of despair she had grown accustomed to. These were different. They were overwhelming, a release so profound it shook her to her core. They streamed down her face, hot and cleansing, blurring the edges of her vision further. It was the sheer, unbearable weight of goodness pressing down on her, a counterpoint so powerful to the evil she had endured that it left her breathless. It was the shock of being seen, truly seen, and valued when she had convinced herself she was invisible. It was an emotional trigger that unleashed not the pain of the past, but the dizzying, beautiful agony of being offered grace. The stark contrast between the recent, bitter darkness and this sudden, radiant light was simply too much to bear. She stood there, the simple gift held tight, completely overwhelmed, tears soaking her face. A silent testament to the devastating power of unexpected kindness. The stranger's eyes, deep and knowing, met hers. They weren't filled with pity, but with a calm understanding that seemed to look right through the layers of exhaustion and fear she carried. The weight of the sealed envelope in her trembling hands felt strangely warm now, less like a burden and more like a promise. A soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the distant scent of rain, a faint perfume of damp earth and growing things. Starkly different from the stale air of the cramped spaces she usually inhabited, he offered a faint, gentle smile.
You look surprised, perhaps even wary. That's understandable. Life teaches you to guard your heart, doesn't it? To expect very little and prepare for disappointment.
His voice was a low, resonant baritone, surprisingly kind, like the steady hum of a forgotten melody. It washed over her, soothing the jangled nerves that had been screaming inside her for weeks. She swallowed, her throat tight, unable to form a coherent question.
A why, you ask? Or perhaps you don't dare ask, fearing the strings attached. There are no strings, only a simple observation.
He paused, the silence between them filled only by the soft rustle of the leaves and the distant city murmur.
I've seen you, not just today, with this small thing. I've seen the weight you carry, the quiet dignity with which you face adversity, the way you haven't let the harshness of the world turn your spirit mean or bitter. That's a rare and precious thing, you know.
Her eyes widened slightly. How could he know? He was just a stranger. Had he seen her stumble? Had he witnessed the cruel words thrown her way? Had he felt the chill of the stairs?
Sometimes.
He continued, his gaze steady.
The universe puts people in your path, not just to take, but to give back. To remind you that not all is shadows, that light exists, and it can find you even when you feel most lost.
He gestured vaguely, taking in the world around them.
I am merely an instrument of that light today, a small push against the current that has been pulling you down. It's not charity in the traditional sense. It's recognition. Recognition of your strength, your quiet resilience, your refusal to surrender your hope, even when hope feels like a distant star.
A single tear tracked a hot path down her cheek, unnoticed by her, until the stranger's gaze softened further.
Consider it a seed,
He said, his voice gentle.
a seed planted in fertile ground. Water it with the strength I've already seen in you. Let it grow into something beautiful. Let it be a sign that you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone in your struggle. The world is cruel, yes, but it also holds moments of unexpected grace. Embrace this one. Use it to find your footing again, to stand taller, to fight harder, knowing that even in the darkest moments, goodness can appear.
His words weren't just sounds. They felt like solid things, building blocks of encouragement settling deep within her. The initial shock had given way to a profound sense of gratitude, a warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the perpetual cold. He wasn't just giving her money. He was restoring a piece of her spirit she hadn't realized was missing. The weight of the small object felt impossibly heavy in her palm, a stark, tangible counterpoint to the ephemeral but cutting words that had pierced her earlier in the day. The chill that had settled deep within her bones from that encounter began to recede, replaced by a surprising warmth emanating not just from the object itself, but from the sheer unexpectedness of the gesture. It was the contrast that struck her most profoundly, the jarring shift from the bitter taste of prejudice to the sweet, unexpected gift from a complete stranger. Earlier, she had felt diminished, cornered by the sheer audacity of the disrespect, the casual cruelty in their eyes and voices. The world had shrunk, made small and ugly by ignorance and hate. The scent of the polluted air, the harsh glare of the sun bouncing off indifferent concrete. It had all felt oppressive, trapping her in that moment of vulnerability. The memory of their smug faces, the echo of their dismissive laughter, still pricked at her mind like tiny, sharp needles. She had carried the weight of their negativity, the feeling of being unfairly judged and targeted, like a physical burden throughout the afternoon. But now, holding this token of unsolicited kindness, the burden began to lift. This wasn't just an object. It felt like an affirmation. It felt like the universe course-correcting, offering a whisper of balance against the day's imbalance. It was a silent rebuke to the negativity she had faced, a form of payback that arrived not through conflict or struggle, but through pure, unadulterated grace. It wasn't a victory over her tormentors, but a victory over the feeling they had tried to impose upon her. The feeling of being less than, of being unwanted. A sigh escaped her lips, not of weariness, but of release. The knot that had tightened in her stomach since the morning loosened its grip. The bitterness on her tongue began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of wonder. How could such a small act undo so much of the damage? How could the simple kindness of one person outweigh the malice of others? It felt like a powerful current, pulling her up from the depths of the trauma. The hurt was still a part of the day's story, a dark chapter she couldn't erase, but it no longer defined the entirety of it. The stranger's gift had written a new ending to the narrative of her afternoon, one filled with unexpected light and the profound realization that even in the face of ugliness, beauty and kindness could still find a way to bloom. She felt herself rising, slowly but surely, above the shadows of that earlier, terrible moment. The stranger's gift was more than just the unexpected solution to a desperate plight. His words, quiet yet firm, had planted a seed in a heart barren from hardship. She had believed the cruelty she faced was the fundamental truth of the world, a cold, hard reality where the vulnerable were simply trampled. But seeing genuine, unasked-for kindness bloom in the face of calculated malice shattered that bleak perception. It was a stark, undeniable contrast. The venomous words and actions of those who sought to destroy her, juxtaposed with the gentle, steady hand that offered salvation. She understood now that the world was not defined by one or the other, but held both within its grasp. Cruelty was a shadow, dark and vast, but kindness was the light, persistent and capable of pushing back the darkness. Hope was not a naive delusion, but a quiet strength, a possibility that shimmered even in the most oppressive air. A quiet strength settled deep within her bones, a warmth spreading through her chest that felt utterly foreign, yet profoundly right. The knot of constant fear and despair that had tightened around her heart for so long began to loosen its grip. The future, which had once seemed a daunting, impassable wall, now stretched before her as an open road. There would still be challenges, she knew, but she would face them not with the bowed head of a victim, but with the steady gaze of someone who had seen the worst and found that goodness still existed. The bitterness that had threatened to consume her began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination and a profound sense of gratitude. She was empowered not just by her circumstances changing, but by her outlook changing. The world hadn't magically become perfect, but her eyes, once clouded by despair, now saw the potential for light. And so the long journey, marked by moments of crushing defeat and unexpected grace, found its quiet resting place. The weight of injustice, though heavy, had not crushed the spirit entirely. It had perhaps tempered it, like steel forged in fire, making it stronger, more resilient. The echoes of the past, the whispers of cruelty, might linger on the edges of memory, but they no longer held dominion over the present. The stranger's act, simple yet profound, had been a turning point, a validation that decency was not dead, that compassion could cut through the most hardened hearts. It served as a powerful reminder that the actions of a few, whether driven by malice or by empathy, could ripple outwards, shaping lives in ways unimaginable. And in that quiet understanding, there was a peace, a deep and abiding sense that while the fight for fairness might be perpetual, it was a fight worth waging, armed with the simple, enduring power of hope.